Jennifer Senior's presence. I keep calling her Jen as if I know her, which I don't, because you call her Jen, which I don't even know if you know her. You've been calling her Jen like throughout. Like your first text message to me was Jen Senior has a piece in the Atlantic, and I misread it as Jan Senior, and I was like, who is Jan Junior? And so I feel like, because I assumed Junior Senior was like the elder, so I was like, who is the elder Jan? And so I looked for a long time for the elder Jan in the Atlantic.
Jan the elder. I don't know any Jennifer who goes by Jennifer. I think maybe that's probably the only thing that we're. I don't know. I don't know Jen Senior, but dollars to bucket. She goes by Jen.
Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. This is, I think, a pretty fun episode. It's definitely one I've been looking forward to for a good while now. My guest today is old friend and frequent topic of conversation on the podcast, Brian Platzer, the author of the novels Bed-Stuy is Burning and The Body Politic, as well as most recently the nonfiction book Taking the Stress Out of Homework, along with Abby Freirich, and so many articles in the Atlantic or the New York Times or the New Yorker. I am not going to try to list them all, but he writes a lot and he talks a lot. I think we had a really fun conversation today. So very, very quickly, before I get into all of that, I do want to thank you all as always for listening, and do go ahead and just take a moment right now, if you have not had a chance yet, to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast or Spotify, Stitcher. Leave a rating if you can. Leave a review even. All of that really helps other people hear about it. And if nothing else, take a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to somebody you think might like it. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please write to sleerickets@gmail.com. Enough housekeeping. I started this podcast partly because I felt there was such a distance, I thought, between the way that poetry got talked about in public, especially in interviews, on podcasts, even in reviews, in public panels, public readings. I thought there was such a huge difference between the way poetry got talked about in public and the way it got talked about in private by any poet I actually had ever bothered to sit down and have a conversation with. And so part of my goal in putting this silly show out there was to reproduce a little bit of the feeling of sitting down and having a drink with a writer and just talking honestly, which is to say, a little bit carelessly, a little bit lazily, a little with a little bit of gossip, maybe, but also with a nerdy devotion to technique and to the kinds of things that really that writers are really invested in. So that is so this week, Brian and I talked about a really good nonfiction essay, a long, really good nonfiction essay. It has several different titles because of the way the internet works, but it is in the Atlantic. It is by Jennifer Senior, and the magazine title of it was 20 Years Gone. I think on the website it's also called a couple of other things, some of which involve the name Bobby McIlvaney, which is he's the central figure in the essay. So it is a serious essay. It's very well done. It deals with a family that lost a loved one on 9/11. It is sad and strange and complicated, and I certainly hope you will go and read it. It may be helpful to read it before you listen, but honestly, the goal is that you be able to listen either way. I say all this, though, to let you know that there are very decorous and polite and gentle and hands-off ways to talk about writing like this in public. And that's fine. And that's very decent. But in private, there is a there is a thing worth talking about, even in the case of an essay about something so grave. And that is simply how the thing does what it does. And I cannot tell you how many conversations with writers that had a similar premise to this one, which is, hey, this was very well done. There's a lot here to admire. And yet, I don't quite understand why everyone is responding the way that they are. Something about this is not quite satisfying to me. Something about this bothers me. Something about this is getting at me. Can you help me figure out what the fuck that is? So Brian and I sat down and tried to answer that question because we both had a similar response to the essay. I say all this just so that you know we are going to speak in pretty direct terms about how the writing in the piece works. And if it's something that you don't want to hear people be irreverent about, then I totally understand, and you probably ought to skip this one. But I think it's a lot of fun. I certainly had a lot of fun talking to Brian, and I hope that you will enjoy it as well. Let's get to that right now. So you sent me this article that I had not, I think I'd seen the headline or something. It's a very, very long, it's like 13,000 words that Jennifer Senior has in the current Atlantic Monthly. It sounds like, I haven't seen the print issue, but it sounds like this is the cover.
It is.
Story.
Yep.
And it's in the magazine, I think it's called 20 Years Lost. In the website, it's called Grief and Conspiracy, 20 Years After 9/11.
Yeah, an alternate title is What Bobby McIlvaine Left Behind. So they do tons of A/B testing, essentially, for internet use, phone, website, etc., to see what gets the most clicks.
I get the Trump country edit in North Carolina. Right. So it's a long, kind of odd, meandering piece about the McIlvaine the McIlvaine family. It's a Pennsylvania family. The dad is a teacher. The mom, I forget, but they had this sort of beautiful star, brilliant basketball playing son, Bobby McIlvaine, who everybody loved, and he was really brilliant, and he went to Princeton, and he tragically was killed on 9/11, sort of happenstance. Like, he was leaving the building after sort of setting up a business presentation in the cafe at the World Trade Center, and he was killed walking down the street. It sounds like, so it was a horrible thing to happen. But then the article,
I don't think the good folks at the Windows in the World would like to be referred to as a cafe. It's just the only first fact check of the day. But yes, please continue.
Is it a fancy restaurant?
It is. It was before the terrorists, or if you listen to Bobby's dad, somebody else took it down. But
right, I guess the New York Manhattan branch of Merrill Lynch probably didn't have their presentation at like a knockoff Starbucks. And
bagged croissants. Yeah,
that is a fancy restaurant where I live. But so he was killed. He was sort of a semi-aspiring novelist, and just sort of like a magical, almost like a manic pixie dream boy with an Ivy League degree that everybody loved, and it was very terrible. But then the article is, talks about him some, but it's really mostly about the complicated, sort of wrenching, embarrassing, weird patterns of grief of the people that he lived with, and also Jennifer Senior's like very, at times, excruciating assessment and like fact checking and evaluation of all of these people's manners of grief. So I found it like very interesting and well written throughout, and it just like constantly rubbed me the wrong way also.
Yes, everything you just said is exactly right. So I wanted to talk about this because I am at a personally a bit of a professional crossroads, where I wrote a couple novels, and then I spent the last year and a half in nonfiction land, actually primarily for The Atlantic, where I was writing a weekly column about education. And I had that same conflicting mindset that you just began to articulate, where what I was reading seemed to me to be a very touching piece in some ways, and also a maddening one to read. And I I found it perhaps a valuable prism through which to discuss just the utility of nonfiction in general, because all of what you said is true, that it's sort of about this impossibly good cipher in the middle of everyone. Not only is he a handsome young white Princeton graduate, but he constantly talks about how much he loves his parents and girlfriend. Also, in an aside, he schooled Kobe Bryant when they were both high school basketball players. Right. This is Kobe Bryant, who left high school basketball to go and become an all-star immediately in the NBA, right out of high school. So it's like he is this dead kid is perfect in every single way. And seeing how Jennifer Sr. takes this story and makes it about how the child died, how there are various ways to grieve. And I left thinking well, this is fascinating, but I'm not quite sure what Jennifer Sr.'s primary goal was, is what happened when I read it. And then I turned on the Twitter machine, and it was lauded in a way that no piece of nonfiction that I've read in the last year or so had been lauded, as great reporting and moving and made me cry with empathy and warmth. And I was just trying to figure out what it is about this type of writing, about this piece specifically, that went through Twitter, which just exists to trash everything, as this perfect example of the form, but that sat a little bit wrongly with me. I wanted to discuss with you whether my reaction to it was more about me or more about the form itself, how to do nonfiction and sort of the value of a piece being true or not, which I've been, fighting with. And then the act of writing it, because Jennifer Sr. not only is a friend of the family's, which gives her a certain narrative authority and I think sympathy from the writer, but she also uses language that draws attention to itself in a very technically interesting way in my mind. So there's just a lot of issues that I've been thinking about as I realized I am definitely a novelist and not a writer of nonfiction self-help about education and how to help your kid take the stress out of homework. And I wanted to discuss with you a similar depth of thought, just whether this was more about the piece, more about me, the value behind the piece, why the piece received such a wonderful, audience, etc.
You did mention in whatever text message or email that you thought it made you think about the boundaries of nonfiction and the novel, and that that may have just sort of affected how I approached it, because I kept having this thought throughout, which was, first of all, in terms of novels, the two that it really, really reminded me of were The Lovely Bones and A Prayer for Owen Meany. But in terms of the kind of the very intimate portrait of the family's crumbling, falling apart, desperately trying to respond to this death, as well as just the retrospective magic of this dead boy. But the thought I kept having throughout the article was if this were a novel, it would be terrific.
Exactly. That's exactly the thought I had. And that's what I tried to think about the value of nonfiction, because people responded to it with the type of rapture that I don't know whether they would have if it had been a novel. And that to me is the opposite response that I had while reading. I shared your response, where I so desperately wanted to get into what was actually going on in the minds of these characters, these human beings, these real people, as opposed to what we have in nonfiction land, which is on one hand, what they say, which to me is always less interesting than what people think, and sometimes the contrast between what they say and what they think can be interesting. But what people say is one very small element of their psychology that interests me less than what novelists have access to, which is the actual thought pattern of these people. So we have access to that. And on the other hand, we have access to Jennifer Sr.'s analysis of the situation. And I think that both what is said and her analysis are valuable, but I think that both, at least to my read of this piece, are lacking in terms of. It's funny, you thought of far better analogs than I did. I haven't read either of them in a couple decades now, but I was thinking about, you mentioned the corrections a couple episodes ago. I was thinking of freedom, not because it has anything to do with this book, but Franzen gets into the mom's head in that book, the sort of housewife character, in a way that, God, if I had access into what was actually going on inside Bobby's mom's mind, it would be, it would be extraordinary. Whether she acknowledges her own jealousy towards the end and doesn't quite have access to it in the beginning of this piece. And again, that temporal trick that Jennifer Senior plays, I think is expert on a craft level, because she holds back knowledge of what the mom eventually thinks in the beginning when she introduces us to the mom. But if we could be inside her head during these therapy groups, and when she's first finding out about her son's missing and then death, and then when she comes to terms with the ex-fiance, etc., there is gold in that. There's real psychological insight that would necessarily be part of that character, as opposed to what we get, which is platitudinous cliche, right? We get the mom saying things that people say about dead people. And to me, that is so much less compelling. The other example I thought of is a lesser discussed work now, but I really think a masterpiece by Kerouac, of all people, a book called Visions of Gerard, which is essentially a fictionalized version of him mourning his too good to be true, but apparently that good and pretty true younger brother who dies as a child. And again, we have a narrator who is so overcome with grief that we are able to wallow in that grief with him, which is as powerful a narrative voice as I've read. But Jennifer Senior can't do that. She's writing a nonfiction piece for The Atlantic, and of course she can't get into the head of these characters because they're real people. And to me, what I felt was lacking, in the same way you did, I was surprised, maybe foolishly surprised, but surprised to see, was the opposite response of most people who read it, who were just overwhelmed by, again, the quality of reporting, the way that Jennifer Senior got to the truth behind these, miseries, or behind these devastations that fascinated me and that caught me off guard. And I don't really know what the word reporting means in the way that it was celebrated. Part of it is, I think that she fact-checked these people in mourning and found that some of what they had said wasn't as they remembered it as being, and that seemed to be a sort of reporting coup in the mind of a lot of readers. To me, it sort of goes without saying that people whose kid died 20 years ago are going to misremember certain details, but maybe that's cynical on my part. But anyway,
the two main, so there's McIlvaney's dad, his mom. So the dad is Bob Senior, the mom is Helen, and then the almost fiance he was just about to propose to, Jen, are the kind of the three principal mourners. Really, it's mostly about the parents, and there are a lot of there's a lot of dysfunction and reversals and misunderstandings, and I guess Jeff, the brother, is the one with sort of the most whole elbow free journey. But there are kind of twin narrative mysteries that this was it was very telegraphed. There's this thing that everybody remembers Bobby saying, but nobody remembers from where, which is life loves on, that they all cling to, and they love it. And it seems
not only they cling to it, the dad tattoos it on his body.
The mom wears a bracelet
wears it as an amulet. And again, the way I talk about things is with this sort of sarcastic, dismissive bent. This happens to be a lovely piece of nonfiction, which all of your listeners should read. It's sort of silly that they're getting our cynical take of it before perhaps reading it, because our cynical take, or maybe I should use the singular, my cynical take on this, is like doesn't deserve to be taken as seriously as anything we're actually discussing, including the lives of these real people or the writing of this like very impressive piece of reporting in some ways. I am more reacting in surprise to the thrill with which everybody else in America who read this reacted to it. So this is a double meta conversation as opposed to the actual way your listener should spend their time, which is reading this article for themselves and thinking about these humans who lost this wonderful person. But continue.
Well, they're already listening to a podcast, so we know they're wasting their time. We know they've already made bad decisions about that. I feel slightly more. I mean, maybe I feel slightly more cynical only in that it felt cynical a little bit what Jennifer Sr. was doing. Like, I feel not at all cynical about these people and their dead son. Her treatment of that story and their experience feels a little bit, the piece that actually it reminded me of in some ways was a piece from several years ago that Katie Waldman published about her anorexic sister that felt, I think it was in Slate, but it was also, I think, lauded and people talked about how important it was to tell this truth about it. Reading it, it felt very much just like a like successful media elite kid dishing on her sick sister. And this is not that grotesque, but there are things that are subtly, there's like a subtle craft to the story, but then there's also these sort of double cliffhanger with like, nobody knows where Life Loves On comes from. It turns out that comes from this diary, and it's actually an error. They're reading it wrong, which Jen Senior, like, she says she feels terrible pointing it out, but she feels great pointing it out. She loves
right. I mean, it is a massive get. She even includes the thrill with which she sends it to the editor. But you are pointing to I think you're pointing to something inherent in writing compelling nonfiction, as opposed to something about this piece where in successful nonfiction, you are manipulating real things that happened into an artificial form to create emotions or give thrill or, argue an opinion to a reader. So you are inherently taking the raw material of real human beings and putting it into an artifice. Right. So like you said you feel that Jennifer Senior was being cynical in writing it. And I would love to parse that out, whether there's really any difference between a cynical author of long form nonfiction and a talented, successful, practiced, craft focus practitioner of long form nonfiction.
Right. I mean, and the difference is that you are that you can be cynical without being all of those other good things.
Right.
And it may be that there is a necessary cynicism to it, but I think it feels a little bit different in this case, partly because all of the events are so private and intimate, and she approaches. So one of the things that sort of drove me crazy, I'm not exactly sure what angle to get at this from, is that she points out and tweaks and fact checks and questions all of these people's responses in a way that like acknowledges her intimate. She says at one point, like, oh, Helen's the kind of person who will spend time picking out silly glasses with you at the store. She did that with me when we were both visiting. So she acknowledges that she has this inside look at the family, but then the perspective of the fact-checking perspective that she brings to the story seems implicitly to be the correct objective view.
So the question of objectivity is fascinating and exactly right. And I think that one of the reasons why she's so appealing to us, to the reader as a narrator, is because she doesn't pretend objectivity. And I think that as readers right now, one of the things that we like least in a writer is somebody who pretends objectivity, because I think that as readers, we have been, whether because of the Iraq War or all the changing, coronavirus certainties or whatever it is. I think, whether for the last 5,000 years or the last 20 minutes, the idea of an author coming in as an objective, certain voice is intolerable to us. So her putting those cards on the table and saying, I'm not pretending objectivity. And you see, she pushes the language here. So she doesn't only write, here I should note that I know the McIlvaney family. She goes one step further. She says, here I should note that I know and love the McIlvaney family, which is, sort of doubling down on that sense of, I acknowledge I'm not objective here. And what she then does is prizes objectivity above all else in her reporting. So she pulls this masterful trick where she's like, listen, not only is this a good story, but it's a story that broke my heart, where she telling the story of someone she didn't know, I think, just like telling the story of somebody else's anorexia who's outside your family might not be as appealing in your analog. Again, I haven't read that piece, so I'm not sure. But I think that she benefits twofold. One, she benefits by she suffered from the loss of this kid. So therefore, her taking advantage of it in this long-form piece of nonfiction journalism, I think the reader is less willing to criticize. But she also takes advantage of it by saying, listen, I might be subjective here. I love these people. Now let me tell you how deeply flawed they are. So it doesn't feel like she is attacking anyone. It feels like she is suffering through the need to tell this story in a way that a objective journalist, would have to do more nakedly.
I kept imagining, and so as I said earlier, I kept imagining this was a novel, but I also kept imagining sort of two alternative versions of it as a nonfiction piece. And it may be that this reveals my taste or my prejudice, just my out of touchness. Like I imagine like one version, and maybe this is really more the novel version, where she just let the errors and so the father becomes a hardcore 9/11 truther who becomes, he's actually like sort of as she and the wife point out at one point, he's sort of a superstar in the strange world of 9/11 truthers, where he travels and he does these interviews, and he's like done nothing but research on the peculiar facts of the however many minutes during the crisis, during the collapse and everything at the World Trade Center. And the mother has gone into a much less exotic kind of denial for a while that then seemed to be something a little bit more healthy. The girlfriend, the dad gave the girlfriend the very last. Bobby kept an insane number of diaries and novels and like just this giant stack of all of his papers. So that when he died, there were all these books, bound and otherwise, of just all of his writings. The dad happened to give the girlfriend the very, very last of these. And then the girlfriend inexplicably refuses to let the mother even have excerpts from that, even like photocopies or like transcriptions of it. Totally, crazily for 20 years. The mother goes insane, demanding or begging for this. The girlfriend won't let her see whatever these 17 pages are. She finally lets Jennifer Senior see them. But throughout this, Jennifer Senior jumps in mostly she comes down really hard on the dad, I think, and like fact checks the dad a lot. And there are two questions she asks that are fucking insane. One is that she says, I finally got up the nerve to ask Bob Senior the obvious question, which was, how are you not like the people who stormed the Capitol, demanded, claiming that Joe Biden had stolen the election, which is an insane question that was not the obvious question to anybody except her, to my mind. And the other thing she says is she asked Helen the obvious question, which is, how have you not divorced Bob Senior? And I think I kept imagining like a version of this story where there were just no fact-checking questions from Jen Senior, where there was just the people's weird, flawed grief happening and just presented nakedly. And then another version where we got to see Jen Senior also be flawed and wrong in some way as a real character. And instead we get just she says, I love them. And I felt awkward asking them these obvious, righteously journalistic questions, but at no point does she ever really step on stage as a as anything other than a kind of an all-seeing chorus.
And when she does, she hides behind rhetorical questions. So we have this passage, which is the closest she gets to pushing the question of how Bobby's mom could live with a man who not only is he a celebrity in the 9/11 was an inside job community. And parenthetically, that community tweeted out this article as well, saying, look at us and our Bob Sr. finally telling everybody that, you know, architecturally it would have been impossible for the planes to take down this, the building. But what Jennifer Sr. does here is she lets rhetorical questions suggest the argument for her. So she writes, you know what radical acceptance is? Living with a husband who has dedicated his life to spreading the word that the United States deliberately orchestrated the collapse of the World Trade Center and then conspired to cover it up. Forget all the chipper advice columns about how to get along again, I put in the again, with your Trump-loving uncle at Thanksgiving. How do you get on in your decades-long marriage after your son has died and your spouse wakes up each morning livid as an open wound and determined to expose the truth? I'd love to hear the answer to that question. That would be a hell of a novel, right? Or a work of nonfiction or something. I mean, how does that work? Because, I mean, and her answer is like, you know what? She remembers when they played catch in the house, you know, or like when Bob was a good dad, or like no one else will know what it was like to lose a son, which is true. I guess within their marriage, they're the only two who know what that's like. But it is this world of leading us to the question that needs to be answered. And I think because of the nature of being edited by the Atlantic, not being able to answer the questions, you know, because nobody knows those answers. And I wonder whether that is part of the reason why it has resonated so broadly now that we are in a moment of such grief and loss and uncertainty that leaving these as rhetorical questions and saying things like, you know, ending with cliches like, you know, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved. You know, basically, the mom hangs out with this group of, I think, all women, perhaps all parents, who have all lost kids. And in a thought experiment, we don't actually see it play out, but in a thought experiment, the mom asks herself if she were to ask everybody in that group whether they all would have preferred never to have had a son, or whether to have had a son who then died, what would they have said? In her hypothetical, they all would have said they would have preferred to have a kid who then gets killed. That is sort of touching in the way platitudes about death can be when you are surrounded by death as an individual or as a culture, but it's not intellectually satisfying. It's not meaningful in any real way, in a way that perhaps a novel could have gotten into those moments where she said, I wish I never had this kid, like, which to me is almost implied in the question itself, that if there weren't moments where she thought, God, my life would be easier and I'd still be married to a normal man if I never had this kid, she wouldn't be asking the hypothetical to begin with. So to me, a more honest analysis of what these people are all going through would have required either more self-knowledge by the individuals, which I think is too much to ask when it comes to somebody whose life is stunted by the death of a perfect son, or more imagination on behalf of the writer in a way that this form does not allow.
One of the truisms about novelists or anybody who writes stories about fictional characters is that you have to both love your characters and be heartless with them, be willing to do and show things in a really awful and merciless way to characters that you're also really deeply invested in, which is part of what makes novels moving. And it felt like, so part of what frustrated me about, I think, reading it is that I kept finding myself, it seemed in the like hierarchy of correct grieving, there's like Jeff, who's like sort of so well adjusted as to be like not really a story. And so she, as you said, she saves them for the end to be resolution. And there's, Jen, who is like, has this like moment that's misguided, but basically understandable. And then the mother, who's very complicated but warm and loving, and then the dad, who really gets in some ways gets the short end of the stick, but in another way, like the dad is the character who feels most truthfully rendered because she is a little bit merciless with him. But I think, as you're saying, like she's not quite willing to. So another thing that this all reminded me of, that was weirdly this review that William Logan wrote of a book of poetry. Thomas James was this American poet who wrote this one book of poetry decades ago and then killed himself at 27, which I think was the same age Bobby McIlvaine was. And Logan, having no rights in this matter, neither father nor lover, like Ruthke, he's able to be cruel in a way about James that would be impossible otherwise. He says, "It's no use exaggerating what Thomas James was. A talent only half born, and that half not quite enough for him to be remembered." And that, I remember it being just like a really horrible, cruel line in the review. But then reading this piece, it felt like a thing that it almost would have been more human and merciful to say at some point, because instead there's the appearance throughout of almost like a compassionate objectivity, an invested personal objectivity, but also a sort of a condescending treatment with kid gloves throughout.
Right. It's a kindness that the facts she presents do not merit, but the emotional tenor of the piece requires. And I think that is where she can rightfully be accused of cynicism in the way that you did before. There are a couple of books which I can't recommend because both of them are like over 750 pages long, but they're both novels that attempt to do what we're talking about, which is get into the mind of the villain and tell a fictionalized story of a true or true-ish character. So both of them received wildly mixed reviews. One of them is a French historical novel called The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell, which gets into the mind and tells the story of a Nazi henchman, essentially, and sort of how he rationalizes and emotionally experiences murdering all these Jews in the Holocaust and then escaping. And I think that's a masterpiece of psychological imagination. And another one is a book called Thomas Jefferson, a novel also called Thomas Jefferson Dreams of Sally Hemings, I believe. And we are similarly in Thomas Jefferson's mind through much of his courtship / rape of his slave. And in both those books, there are moments of almost surrealism because of the impossibility of being in the mind of characters who are so vicious and yet, protagonists in their own stories. But I feel a hunger in me come out when I'm reading a piece like this for those exercises in imagination, and seeing it in Jennifer Senior, but seeing her boxed in by the form, I think was one of the greatest tensions I had in reading it as well. But something else I wanted to ask you about is, the more I thought about this, the more I realized that I think for maybe my whole nonfiction reading life, the more I know about the subject of a piece, the more the piece seems full of half-truths and lies. If I read about what happens in Afghanistan, it seems like totally objective, straightforward, good reporting. God bless the Times reporters who are risking their life and telling you what's happening in Afghanistan. Whereas if I read somebody's account of my neighborhood in Bed-Stuy going through gentrification, my attitude is only like, well, that's not true. Like, that's not really what's happening between neighbors in the restaurants. Or like, I went to this dopey, swanky, super expensive private school for high school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And at the time, New York Magazine, I guess they saw that these issues sold, but it was like literally every year they would put out this is what's going on in New York City fancy private schools now. And like one year it's like, all the girls are lesbians, and I'm like, I don't know, like, there are a lot of girls here, and most of them aren't gay, or like the year after that, everybody's being mugged, and it's like, can you look at these rich people, like, can you believe it? They're all being mugged, and it's like, well, no, we're not being mugged. And I just wonder whether, like, there's something about this piece that is uncomfortably on the border of that, where it's like, I didn't have a family member die in 9/11, but I do have people who are close to me who had friends and family die in 9/11. And reading this piece, I know just enough about sort of the Ivy League world and people who have lost loved ones, and what it's like to be in New York City at this time, and what the uncertainty and then pain and grieving is like, that, like, I know just enough about this that I am appalled by it. And as a writer of nonfiction myself, the cruelest emails I get are always from subject experts. So what I've written the most about in my nonfiction lives have been neurological disorders, because I myself suffer from a undiagnosable neurological disorder, and education, because I'm a teacher and have thought a lot about this and done a lot of reading, into it. And the vast majority of responses I get are positive, saying, thank you for bringing this to more people's attention. I also suffer in this way. And although it's not, exactly the same, I was so excited to read somebody having, a similar experience. Or, my kid goes to school, and thank you, this is an interesting way to think about a predicament that we're approaching. But where the real vitriol comes from is from neurologists who say, like, no, like, you're spreading misinformation. Or from fellow teachers who say, like, if you ever did that in a real classroom, you'd be ruining the lives of children. Now, like, I've spoken in researching these neurological disorders to hundreds of neurologists, and I know that they have various opinions on these issues. And then it's my job as the guy who gets paid $250 by the New York Times to, like, make this into a coherent argument or an understanding of what's going on in this world of difficult to explain neurological disorders, or as the guy who's trying to explain, like, how to get your kid through going back to school. For the Atlantic, like, I've spoken to all these teachers, and I try to get parents decent advice. But there is the sense of, when the neurologists and teachers are scolding me for my work, that I sort of empathize with them, because they don't want to see somebody else talk about their areas of expertise in this formal public way, because they feel like they could be doing it and they could be doing it better. And I wonder whether that's just like a real problem with nonfiction, that we have all of this raw material as writers of nonfiction. We have to bring it into 750 words or 50,000 words, however long this Jennifer Senior piece is. And inherently, we just make decisions. And those decisions aren't any more accurate or true than other decisions we could make. It's just ways of telling this story. And for critics of criticism like you and me, we are made crazy by that, because we said, like, I see what you're doing, Jennifer Senior. Like, you save the kid who survives until the end in order to provide a good feeling. Or, I see what you're doing. You knew that Life Loves On wasn't accurate when you started writing it, but you saved that to the end as a way to, provide a little gift to the reader. But, like, that's not a criticism that we see what she's doing. That's just using the tools of the form. And I think that's why nonfiction isn't as satisfying to me as fiction, because it is less true. And I'm an asshole for finishing like that, because obviously it's not less true. And it's exactly one of those squiddleisms that you talked about in the last episode. The thing. Oh,
yeah. Mott and Bailey. Yeah. Deepities.
Deepities, squiddleism. I just don't, I think that nonfiction has to follow these rules and has to be more artificial than good fiction.
Yeah, and there's, since it was like Philip Roth in the 60s wrote a thing about how reality was outpacing fiction, and there've been a million pieces since then about how reality TV, or like reality news writing it has begun to make fiction writing obsolete, because we sort of hunger for the real or realish thing, or reality is wilder and crazier and more inventive than any novelist's imagination. I do wonder about, like, because I did think of your second novel, Body Politic, is a New York novel dealing with about like the intimate lives of the circle of friends, dealing with public and private trauma. It's mostly, it's like personal trauma. There's some terrible things that happen, and then it's the election of Trump. That's not a 9/11 novel, but it has a little bit of like the shadow of like a big public disaster, and it's in New York.
And the four friends meet immediately after 9/11. And
that's right.
In their beginning of their friendship, they sort of touch upon 9/11 as one of the aspects that bring them together, and then a counterpoint to the Trump election.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. So it is. I wonder if like part of my resistance to or resentment of this piece is a writerly irritation at, is there like you said people responded to this with a warmth and approval that you can't imagine attending the publication of a novel. Is there do you feel like a suspicion of, or a worry about nonfiction of this kind displacing like fiction doing this kind of job? Like, is that part of the, what is
no, because
why
I feel
so
like
irritated by it? Or
I feel like they've always lived in parallel. I think that the idea of anybody saying this historical moment will fundamentally change art is sort of dopey, because like, why the historical moment as opposed to discovering the new world, or like inventing fire? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. My response, I think, will be less helpful and take a further step back, which is that we fetishize the truth. I think it's part of the reason why American men don't read literary fiction. They read biographies and history. I think that people want to feel as though they're learning. People want to feel as though when they're reading, because it takes some effort, maybe because it takes some effort, or maybe just because they wish they had taken school more seriously. I think that people want to feel as though they are making good use of their reading time and learning facts that they can then present conversationally, or that can help them reorder their vision of the world, is valuable. Whereas looking through the secret thoughts of fake people is, tantamount to gossip. It's not valuable in that same way. And I find gossip far more interesting than fact. Like, I'm willing to talk about why people do stuff and what the secret lives of my friends are forever. I just find that's far more a compelling way that speaks to what makes human being human far better than just like the biography of our founding fathers, which seems to be, I said we fetishize the truth. It's the same argument about fetishizing the original American, founding fathers. We as a culture, scratch that, we as a culture, you can say anything you want after that. I have seen a lot of people, including my now 40-year-old friends and my dad and a lot of other people I know, who have read a little bit of fiction in the past or in college, or think of themselves as readers, move entirely to nonfiction, because I think there's the misconception that nonfiction has a value in and of itself, whereas fiction is just for pleasure.
Yeah, and that's the again, I don't know how real this is, but the old observation that people would make about how fiction was initially almost like a female innovation, that it was
right. It's like what ladies would do in their drawing room between harpsichord lessons. Like we think of it as, people say, like, you think violent video games are bad. People say the same thing about novels back in the day, which, like, who knows if that's true or not. Everything becomes apocryphal when you tell comparison stories like that historically. But it is like novels are gossipy nonsense, whereas like the truth matters more. Like, but I mean,
yeah, though, like my dad reading the Hamilton biography it's not like that actually supplies him with any information that's like it's really important that it's true and that can then apply to the world. Like it's also gossipy entertainment,
right? In the same way that everything by Malcolm Gladwell is entertaining.
Oh yeah,
under the guise of truth, and those are the nonfiction books that again are just truey enough, that just have enough science in them and just have enough aspect that these popular science, again, it's easy to dismiss popular science because like you read one of these books and either it resonates with you or it is clear that half of it is unquestionably true. Like, why would you bother making that point? And the other half is like probably wrong. So why would you bother making that point? But the combination in the right form, lets Malcolm Gladwell say that if you look at something and you're an expert, then you know it kind of well, which like is obviously true, but like obviously false, and who cares? I think that it feels to most readers that if you read a book by Malcolm Gladwell, you have learned something about the way the brain works. And if you read the biography of Hamilton, you have learned something about the way America works. And I disagree.
There is a way of feeling tickled or stimulated that one gets from a Malcolm Gladwell book that maybe has more to do with the feeling of what it is like to have a special perspective on things than it is like you're not really equipped with anything that you didn't have before that's going to make your life different. It'll just change the way you talk about that at the neighborhood potluck.
I love the neighborhood potluck. And now just to circle back to why you and I are specifically frustrated by a piece like this Jennifer Senior's piece, I think that is more of the answer than what maybe you or I proposed earlier. It's that we see the writerly manipulations in this piece and say like, this isn't truth in a way that poetry or fiction lacks truth. It's just a different way of telling a story, but it gets to be called truth. It gets to be a part of our, history in a way that poetry and novels don't. And I think that I am probably selfishly, myopically perturbed by that distinction.
So I want to talk a little bit more about fiction and nonfiction, but first, the most uncomfortable and shitty thought I had about this article that I'm curious to get your thought on is that there's an element of it that feels not incidental, that Bobby McIlvaney was sort of a would-be Ivy League to New York elite. He was like he worked for Merrill Lynch in New York, and he like came from a poor-ish working class Pennsylvania family and was the smartest boy. It's like my wife was like the smartest person in her small town, and like this guy was sort of like, he was the star and he ascended. And there's even like, to my mind, like a sort of gross passage about like it was so amazing that he was going to go to Princeton, and it was like him becoming president. And like, all right, the teacher said, okay, now you start saving your pennies, and the whole family needs to work together to see that he can ascend to his true place. There's an
Helen usually starts by telling people that Bobby went to Princeton, but that's hardly because she's status fixated. It's because she and Bob Sr. did not expect to have a child who went to an Ivy League school. They both went to state schools in Pennsylvania, not even particularly well-known ones. Both of their kids were sporty, but when Bobby was 8, his 3rd grade teacher said to them, and they both remember her exact words, although of course, according with these people, the exact words were probably different. Start saving your pennies, in quotations. This one's education might cost you.
Right. And so Jennifer Senior says she knows Bobby McIlvaney or knew him because he happened to be suite mates with her brother, and then roommate and like close friends with her brother. So she and her brother also went to Princeton. And there was a part of this story that it felt like it wasn't incidental, that these people who were mostly the subject of the story, the parents and their son, and they are non big city elites. They are non Ivy Leaguers. Bobby and Jen Sr. and her brother, and the perspective of the Atlantic is this elite perspective. And that felt maybe like part of the question about how there's like a couple times where she like weirdly compared, like Bob Sr., who like is reading about the evils of the CIA and like protests the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and like became a like devoted a progressive activist because of his son. She like twice pointedly compares him to Trump supporters in a way that just like it felt a little bit like this was the kindly condescending illumination of the non-elite by the Ivy League certified New York media elite. That was a little like the feeling I had, that I also felt like was uncharitable and unfair for me to feel. But I'm curious what your take is on that.
As a member of the Ivy League educated New York City elite, I can weigh in on that. I think he's a perfect victim, right? Like we're told, especially when Black kids get shot by the police, that there's no such thing as the perfect victim. But he really is the perfect victim. Like he, again, not only did he come from nothing, but like that's not true. Like he definitely came from like two educators, right? Like who went to college and had enough money to save and were excited to send him to Princeton. And not only did he score those 14 points over Kobe Bryant. Sorry, he scored 16 points off Kobe Bryant that day. But he went to Princeton, which is like the most obnoxious of all the Ivy League schools. And he got a job in a finance company, right? But what he really wanted to do was become a novelist. So like he is perfect in every single possible way, which you can feel some of the tension in the writing where either an editor told Jennifer Sr. or Jennifer Sr. found in her own mind, like the move to say like, it's getting a little bit too perfect. So listen to this paragraph, which is the only one in the piece that questions Bobby's perfection. When he arrived at college, Bobby retained a bit of an alpha dog streak. He was still competitive, even while playing mindless, made-up dorm games. He wasn't bashful about ribbing friends. He was tall and handsome and had a high level of confidence in his sense of style, which may or may not have been justified. So like the three things that which may or may not have been justified caught my eye because it's so ambiguous and odd. Like, what is that doing in this piece? So he thought he dressed well, and I'm not going to say he didn't dress well. I'm going to tell you that he might or might not have dressed well, implying that he didn't dress well. But like, what college freshman dresses well? Like, is that even like a category of person? So like the three things that are bad about him are he sometimes could be an alpha dog, which is a meaningless expression, right? He was competitive, even if the games were invented, and he thought he dressed well. So like that is in this, in order, that paragraph exists in this piece in order to try to humanize him and make him less perfect, but it's unable to, right? He's perfect even in trying to seek out imperfections. So the long answer is what I just gave. The short answer is yes. I feel like this is a special type of person where if his parents were Ivy League graduates and he were an alumnus at Princeton, his loss wouldn't be mourned to the same way. And if he hadn't gone to Princeton, his loss wouldn't be mourned in the same way. But this like American, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you're a magic, as you say, manic pixie dream boy character, from the beginning. And although you need to make money because like money is what you do in these things, really what you want to be doing is writing novels. It lets everybody see themselves in this kid, whether you're poor or rich, a money man or a novel man, whether your family is a Trumpist or left-leaning, even though everyone in this piece appears to be left-leaning.
Right.
Like it's a way to create, again, that cipher in the middle of the story where he's only a hero and you can read whatever heroic tendencies you want to into him. I'm sorry, not only that, but Toni Morrison wrote about this white kid.
Wrote two. Oh, what his real? There's a weird. His real passion was African American studies. That was his major.
Right.
And Toni Morrison
and
wrote
after
two letters.
Bobby died, the McIlvaney's got not one but two condolence notes. So Toni Morrison. So Toni Morrison wrote one note, presumably after the kid died. Toni Morrison, a Princeton professor, right? And then the second one came, I guess there must have been a lag between when he died and when she read the term paper, or maybe upon realizing who this kid was, again, followed up or just needed to say. But he is not only a better basketball player than Kobe Bryant, but as a white kid, he wrote one of the most accomplished and insightful term papers in African American culture that Toni Morrison has ever read. And again, it's true. So I don't know why my instinct is to be dismissive of it. So help me figure out my own reaction to that. So like there's no way that Jennifer Senior, who's a wonderful journalist for the New York Times, she was the book critic for a while. Now she's sort of a critic at large. She writes these longer form pieces, this one for the Atlantic. Why does it bother me that she just says the truth about this kid, which is that he must have been really smart because he wasn't a legacy to Princeton and he got in somehow. So like in some objective way, he was worthy of this fancy school. He must have been good at basketball because Kobe Bryant was on the other team and he scored all these points against them. He must have been interested in African-American literature and culture because Toni Morrison wrote that it was insightful and accomplished. Like, so what is it that frustrates me in his perfection in us? Like, are we just jealous?
Yeah,
like, we can't be jealous of a dead kid, can we?
Right. We are definitely.
We doubt it. We're skeptical, right? We don't believe he's as good as he's being presented to us as. And why is that? Is that because no one we've ever met in our lives was this good? Or
yeah. So the passage you read about him having a questionable sense of style and being an alpha dog and being competitive, I read that as a paragraph that appeared in lieu of quotes from some of his other suite mates who said like, "Well, it's sad that Bobby died, but he was kind of an asshole." Like that's what I imagined, which like is definitely true of every single person. Like it's true of every person,
especially freshman year of college.
Oh my God. Yeah. Like that somebody who met you in college hates you. Like that's definitely true of every person who attended college or, and in a way, like the other thing I thought about, because she mentions he wanted to be a novelist and like he had so much writing on his desk and like when he started working at Merrill Lynch, he still wanted to write novels and he like first started in book publishing and he like had 2 novel drafts sitting on his desk, but then like nowhere does she says at some point like, oh, he was sort of like, you can feel that he's still a kid writing, but then by the time he's 27, he's very mature. No, in a way, like I think my heart would have gone out to him only more if at some point she had said, also, I read his 2 novels and they were very bad, which like would have felt very true. And I think part of what feels weird and not quite right about some of this is not just that he's like a very, very special boy, but that it also would have been sad if he were not a very special boy, or like if he were a very special boy who also like had a DUI and like was really mean to one of his ex-girlfriends. And like that also would be a terrible loss and would be inexplicable and would leave us with all these open wounds. That in a way, like part of the implication is that, as you said, like had he been a janitor leaving the World Trade Center, it wouldn't have been this. There wouldn't be a halo surrounding the loss in this way. But also,
and also Jennifer Sr. wouldn't have known him, right? Which is the other complicated aspect of this piece, where it can only be told in this voice by an Atlantic author. I'm sure there are some Atlantic authors who are friends with janitors, but for the most part, the writers for the Atlantic who have access to people who died on 9/11 will have access to this type of kid. But also what you said is helping me understand why I am frustrated by how extraordinary Bobby was, because I probably would have hated Bobby, right? If I went to school with him and there was this kid who was better than Kobe Bryant at basketball and was the best student Toni Morrison ever had and was a novelist and was super competitive in dorm games that didn't matter and was making money for Merrill Lynch afterwards, but still was calling himself a novelist, and who constantly told his parents how much he loved them. He was on the phone with them for hours every night, even though his friends were like, why are you talking to your mom so much, man? And who rehearsed in writing form how he was going to propose, how he's going to ask permission to his girlfriend's father, including the line something like, I so admire you as the head of the family. And the more I read about him, the more I realize that if I knew him, I think I would have really disliked him. And this piece doesn't allow him the humanity to be disliked. It doesn't allow the reader the nuance to think of this kid as a human being, as opposed to as a saint or a martyr. And maybe that's what frustrated me in reading it, is that inherent in so many of his positive characteristics, I guess, at least if we're talking about any human being I've ever met, would be like, he's probably intolerable in some ways, in many ways. Like Brian Platzer, probably would dislike this guy. So maybe I just want to be allowed to, but why do I care about disliking a dead guy? The piece isn't even about him. It's about how his death turned his parents into different versions of themselves. But then I guess I would have liked to have real access into those different versions of the lives that he turned his parents in. The piece is more tantalizing than it is satisfying. And it was read as satisfying, at least among the thousands of people within my Twitter retweet orbit.
So I did do the Zoom reading this past weekend, and it went very well, and Marianne and Frank were terrific, and the people who tuned in to watch and listen and ask questions, there's a good crowd and a really lovely response, including a couple of SLEERICKETS listeners. So I was touched and grateful, and I think it went well. There was one question that came up that it was it caught my attention, partly because I was thinking about this interview, which I had actually recorded just that morning. And it was a question, I think Cameron actually asked a question about autobiography and invention or imagination. And it brought to mind, for me at least, the question of authenticity in the events of a poem, or the authentic confession of a poem. Confessional poetry is long past fashionable, and then absorbed into the mainstream and into the status quo. But readers remain interested in poems that seem to be about the poet's real life, and there is some power still in the really having happened-ness of certain kinds of events in a poem. So as with the essay that Brian and I talked about this week, it's not just a matter of the pure form of the story. It's not just a matter of the descriptions or the insights. There is something about how true to life we believe it to be that moves us, whether or not we're right, whether or not our sense of reality is accurate. That feeling is a significant part of our experience as readers in prose, as well as in poetry. So today I'm going to read a poem, one of my just favorite poems. I read a good little while ago a poem by Ashley Anna McHugh called "The Unquarried Blue of Those Depths is All But Blinding." And that poem takes its title from a line in this poem that I'm going to read today, which is just called "A Letter" by Anthony Hecht. It is, as with most of Hecht's poems, it is given mostly in a pretty high register with some highfalutin language in it. But I think he is a master of tone and of the quality of speech such that he is able to communicate a feeling of authenticity even when using language that we might associate with a college classroom. So the poem, just to give you a little bit of, just to give you your bearings, takes the form of a letter to somebody that the speaker of the poem, who we suppose this to be Hecht, or I suppose it to be Hecht, but the speaker of the poem has had an affair with this woman. And that affair is over, and they are both married, and they are still both married. And so he is writing to her by not writing to her, because once upon a time she gave some stuffed animals to his sons when they were kids, and just today he happened to find them, and they brought everything back. So this is a letter by Anthony Hecht. I have been wondering what you are thinking about, and by now suppose it is certainly not me. But the crocus is up, and the lark, and the blundering blood knows what it knows. It talks to itself all night like a sliding moonlit sea. Of course, it is talking of you. At dawn, where the ocean has netted its catch of lights, the sun plants one lithe foot on that spill of mirrors, but the blood goes worming through its warm Arabian nights, naming your pounding name again in the dark heart root. Who shall, of course, be nameless. Anyway, I should want you to know I have done my best, as I'm sure you have too. Others are bound to us, the gentle and blameless, whose names are not confessed in the ceaseless palaver. My dearest, the clear, unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding. You may remember that once you brought my boys 2 little woolly birds. Yesterday, the older one asked for you upon finding your thrush among his toys, and the tides welled about me, and I could find no words. There is not much else to tell. One tries one's best to continue as before, doing some little good. But I would have you know that all is not well, with a man dead set to ignore the endless repetitions of his own murmurous blood. I don't want to spend too much time on the poem because I think it's just a really lovely poem, but I do enjoy the perpetual tug of war between frankness and circumlocution that this poem takes. He goes to great lengths to not to say explicitly what is happening with his body or what might once have happened with their bodies by invoking the crocus and the lark and this elaborate metaphor of subterranean water. But he also can't help but be called back simply to the blood again and again, which is central not just to life, but of course to sex in several different ways. And in fact, blood is the very last word of the poem. It's a poem partly about denial. He is very explicitly not naming this person. This is a secret. This is something not to be spoken of. After his long, elaborate apostrophe to her in the first two stanzas, he drops the metaphorical flourishes and says simply, "Who shall of course be nameless." He can't say her name. And then he, later in that same stanza, he invokes another kind of denial. He says, "Others are bound to us, the gentle and blameless." Their spouses, presumably, their families, the people who would be hurt if all of this were to come out. "Others are bound to us, the gentle and blameless, whose names are not confessed in the ceaseless palaver." This is not the same kind of confession as it would be if he named this woman. He's saying that in their own private reveries, in that ceaseless palaver of the heart, the names that are not confessed are the names of the innocent loved ones. It is exactly the wrong name that keeps coming back, that keeps insisting on being spoken. And of course, the poem as a whole is a sort of a tease, a flirtation with the possibility of authenticity, because if it is all mere invention, if it were acknowledged to be all mere invention, then it would lose some of its poignancy. Part of what makes this poem sting is that it is not, this is not the poem of a good guy. This is not the poem of someone who is himself gentle and blameless. This is the poem of someone who knows that he's in the wrong. But his feelings are genuine nonetheless. And if all of that is simply an invention, if it's all just made up for the sake of a neat poem, then that balance between our disapproval of his actions and our sympathy for his feelings, that balance becomes a little bit weightless, a little bit meaningless. That it is important that he not say what really happened, but it's also important that we sort of believe that something really happened. And he acknowledges at the end that this tug of war is not really sustainable. It's not really a balance. It's not really equal. That the poem is not articulating a stable or sustainable condition. It's just articulating a moment in that condition. He knows, and he says, and he wants to make sure that she knows, although, of course, he's also not actually writing to her. "I would have you know that all is not well with a man dead set to ignore the endless repetitions of his own murmurous blood." However true any of this is, however confected, however disciplined his performance, it's one that he can't keep up. Not for long. That was a letter by Anthony Hecht. It appeared in his, I think, second book, The Hard Hours. A really extraordinary book. This is SLEERICKETS. Thank you so much for listening. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.